valuable gift. Perhaps it's a gift, you know, not something the philosophers might view. God, this guy is just murdering philosophy. What's he doing out there? And he's putting it on YouTube. But anyway, no, hopefully it's a gift. You know, hopefully other people, maybe somewhere, somebody, somewhere will come across and actually try to take seriously a sustained and disciplined study of environmental ethics over the internet, and that hopefully will help them if they find it. But anyway, it's kind of buried. Anyway, so we have some more work to do today with deep ecology, and but we also have our final project to think about. Okay. And we also have, some of you want to write a final, want to do a written take-home, written final exam, okay? And you know, I expect, it's pretty predictable, but I expect in a class of 45 students, about 15, approximately 15 of you will choose to do the written option for various reasons. And then that'll leave us about 30 students to participate in a group project, okay? And we'll talk about some more about the group project today. But just so you know, this is an option. This is a written final exam, and it's kind of cool. And in this one, you get to consider Celilo Falls as well as Lower Snake River dam removal. Because in this one, you're presented with, and I emailed this to everybody, and I also emailed, and I'm going to send out a sign-up sheet. Send this sign-up sheet around to just start getting a rough identification of the two groups that are going to be going at it over Lower Snake Dam removal. Okay, that's the plan. We're not going to worry on the final and the group presentations and the final, you know, what we're doing for the final exam period. We're not going to worry about Celilo Falls. But for those of you who want to write, who choose the written option, then the third policy option is involves restoring Celilo Falls as well as restoring the Lower Snake River. You know, the way I teach about salmon in this class is that it's a whole cycle, right? It's a cycle that involves spawning streams, rearing streams, you know, where the babies kind of live, where they're fairly safe from predation, and then migratory, you know, migrations, and then ocean habitat, right? It's just vast. The ecosystem of a salmon is vast, but it involves production, generation, engenderment sites, right? The spawning and rearing habitats that we're concerned about when we talk about the Lower Snake dams, right? We're concerned about repairing the migratory habitats between the ocean and the breadbasket, you know, the main, most productive area of salmon spawning, which is all that east Idaho, western slope of the Rocky Mountains, salmon and Clearwater rivers. But there's also, you know, the way I always teach this material about salmon is we have to remember that it's a whole cycle, and there are harvest sites too, right? There are prime harvest sites that I've drawn our attention to for non-human species like the orcas in Puget Sound. They go out, they sneak out to the coast, and they intercept all those migrating Chinook. They're returning home, right? They're swimming from north to south, returning home to spawn in the either in the Lower Snake or in one of the tributaries, right? And then there are humans too, though, right? And that is where the issue of Celilo Falls looms large, because Celilo Falls, if not the densest concentration, which is somewhat lower, farther downriver, was the most famous, right? It wasn't it didn't have the most sites, but it was the most famous just because of its picturesque nature and of its historical use. You know, people used it for thousands and thousands of years, right? And that was the main salmon, the most famous salmon harvesting site for human beings, right? For us who also play, right? For the human animal who evidently, for many, many, many thousands of years, played a key role in the whole salmon ecosystem, and a role that did not result in the destruction of the resource, right? So if we want to talk about restoring the whole cycle, right? And not just focusing on species restoration and wilderness preservation, the way we perhaps might be doing if we focus only on Snake River, right? That's a good start, right? But if that's all we focus on, then we're still neglecting the whole bigger picture, which involves the human role in harvesting salmon. And that's where discussion of restoring Celilo Falls, might be really important. This might be a place, for example, where some environmental ethicists are going to focus on because this place is a key intersection point between nature and culture. And whereas restoring the lower snake is more, that's kind of remote. I mean, sports fishers will certainly appreciate that. And river rafters, some great new river rafting habitat gets opened up, and some new, sports fishing, right? And then long term, if, we restore a whole lot of habitat and we restore the flow regime of the river to where it used to be, then maybe we could actually restore some kind of commercial fishery. Right now, the only commercial fishery, the only people who can legally catch and sell salmon from the Columbia Basin are the Native Americans, right, under the Stevens treaties. That's the only. A few years ago, there was still a lower river commercial fishery, all with gill nets too, but that was shut down. That was shut down, I think, a few years ago because there just aren't enough salmon left to harvest. So the only remaining commercial fishery in the whole Columbia Basin is the indigenous, the Stevens Treaty fishers in the Mid-Columbia. They're still out there, using their little in-lieu sites, and it's really an amazing story. I urge all of you to look deeper into that. And pay attention when you travel around the Columbia River on both sides. There are 31 of those in-lieu sites on the north and south. And they're all meant to replace or somehow compensate, right, for the loss of all those historic sites that were flooded when Bonneville Dam was installed. Right, Bonneville just flooded hundreds and hundreds of traditional fishing sites. And then the Dalles Dam came along in '57, and that flooded the rest of the sites in the gorge. Anyway, but so those of you who want to write, do the written take-home option, it would be much like the midterm, roughly the same kind of expectation of how many words and how the length, all that. And it seems like kind of a fun project to do. And I ask you, and we're just going to stick with deep ecology and social ecology, because that's kind of the confrontation at the end of the term that we want to think about philosophically, right? We want to think about the deep ecological perspective, which is a more than anthropocentric perspective, primarily, although it's metaphysically pluralist. That's what many people don't appreciate about deep ecology, is that actually they're not really committed. They're more like, they actually have more in common with Norton and his convergence hypothesis. It so happens that Naas and his Spinocism and some of his buddies who had deep spiritual inclinations from maybe some major religion or some Eastern religion, right? And so deep ecology is very attractive to people who already have sort of an inclination toward Eastern religion or toward some sort of Native American spiritual practice. In any event, this last part of the term is and you'll notice the social ecologists line up quite nicely with the holistic anthropocentrists, right? And then the deep ecologists line up quite nicely with folks like Rolston and the neo-Kantian ecocentrists, all right? But anyway, so I ask you to consider which of those three policy options. Remember, these are the three policies. There's business as usual. Now, for our final project, we only have to focus on two policy options, okay? That's the difference, the main difference, all right? And we'll get to the final project in just a minute, and I'll send out a sign-up sheet for you to just get a tentative idea, of who's going to be on what team, all right? So I ask you, if you want to take the written option, to consider what a deep ecologist would argue for, which policy option of these three, A, B, or C, and then what policy option would a social ecologist argue for. And then the more you can tie in all the material we've been covering all term, the better, obviously. Okay? And the more you can tie in about moral psychology, meta-ethics, normative ethics, etc., the better you're going to do. Okay? All right, so getting over to our group projects. So I have decided, and I thought, I went back and forth, you know, last time in class I mentioned that we're going to try to adopt, we're going to try to envision a society which has already adopted and then act as though our society has already adopted Christopher Stone's guardianship, right? But I realized, you know, come on, and actually I realized, you know, maybe practically speaking, there are obviously there are some problems that Stone needs to overcome. And anybody who wants to implement some kind of guardianship system of the nature like what Stone proposes has his work cut, you know, his or her work cut out. I mean, there are a lot of details. Like, for example, it seems as though Stone's proposal is best suited for cases where a private property owner, right, or a business is doing something to the land, right, to harm it, right? But what about when a whole government agency has done it? You know, we're not talking about some private, you know, resource extractive Weyerhaeuser company or something here. You know, when we talk about the 4 lower snake dams, we're talking about the federal government who has made this decision, presumably in its infinite wisdom, about what's good for the people, right? And there's no question that the residents of the Northwest got some pretty sweet deals out of all this hydropower construction, hydro development going on, right? We got some of the we have the cheapest electricity rates in the country. Not to mention all the industries and utility companies that benefit from cheap electricity. You know, not just consumers, but all kinds of industries benefit from the power that we produce. You know, that's relatively clean, right? At least it doesn't emit greenhouse gases. Although that's a bit of a, gotta be really careful. Because actually the reservoirs behind the dams cause the water to generate much more greenhouse gases than it did. Now I don't know details, right? But we need to be careful there. When we start saying that there are no greenhouse gas emissions and that's what makes wait a minute. The reservoir, when you slow the water down, you cause algal blooms, and at certain times of the year, particularly the summer, that reservoir is excreting all kinds of methane. You know, methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. That river is supposed to be tight and cold, right? Tight banks, cold water coming out of the mountains, right, that the salmon love, just tumbling and churning its way through the ocean. And instead, it's just a series of sluggish slackwater ponds. Of course, it's going to produce more methane. In any event, you know, we need to always be careful with a lot of these empirical claims, you know, are not exactly consistent with what we now know. You know, so in any event, I think I have divided up the two sides fairly objectively. I mean, I think if this was, you notice what we're doing now is we went deep into theory, right? But now we're kind of trying to emerge on the other side and think about how all these different theoretical orientations that we've been studying approach political issues, approach policy questions, all right? And we're going to focus on this one really big policy question. If there's anything left of the environmental movement in the Pacific Northwest, this is that movement's main issue. And it has been for a long time. Removal of the lower snake dams, because salmon are our main resource, right? And removal of the 4 lower snake dams would do more to restore our main resource than anything else. And it's necessary, all right? Absolutely necessary. It's a sine qua non of salmon restoration. You know, all these things on the periphery, right? Restore a stream way over there, you know, stuff like that. But if you don't speed up the main body of the river, then all the other stuff you're going to do is virtually pointless. So, you know, it's the sine qua non, that without which, you know, the whole project of salmon restoration might as well just be tossed out the window, right? So we need to get real, basically. We need to get real about managing the river and make the choice that we should have made a long time ago. Do we want all these dams and all this harvest of kilowatts, all this electricity, all this cheap electricity? Is that what we want? Do we want that? Or do we, right? Because it isn't either one. We can't have both. They told us we could have both, and that's how they slid these dams under the radar and got them all installed, right? But it turns out that they were wrong. We can't have both, and so we have to choose once and for all. And so this debate about the lower snake dams is really a crossroads, right? Are we going to become plain citizens of our biotic community? Are we going to become indigenous, right? Like the indigenous people of this area, respecting the different living beings that we share our journey through life with, right? Or are we going to go 100% corporate where everything is privatized, where every drop of water, every speck of dust, everything has a dollar value attached to it and is exploited before it goes to any other beings, right? Any other life forms. It's exploited by humans, right? And that's where we're going, right? We can only sustain, the whole system is on life support, right? You guys kind of get that, right? With these Corps of Engineers vacuuming up the poor little smolts above the dams, right? And putting them in barges or trucks and driving them down. That's life support, right? And it's very expensive life support. It's, you know, just like life support for a human being. It's very, very expensive. It costs hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars every year in taxpayer money, right? So do we want to keep doing that? And then eventually the salmon are going to go, and then we're going to realize we shouldn't have spent all this money on mitigate. We shouldn't have been vacuuming up the little smolts to begin with. It was crazy. It was a waste of money because these guys were going to go extinct. Let it go, right? Let them go. Get over it, right? Or take out the freaking dams and get serious about speeding up the flow rate of the river, right? That's the choice we face. So that's kind of what we're getting down to in our little hearing, right? And I realized that it's kind of silly to think about how would we proceed if we were using Christopher Stone's, right? The Corps of Engineers would be the defendant, the plaintiff, you know, the guardian of the Snake River would bring lawsuit against the Corps of Engineers. Anyway, there's a lot of kinks to work out, and so I wanted to get as real as possible. And since we're not living under Christopher Stone's system, we're living under the system we have now. As far as I can tell, it's going to be an act of Congress. It would require an act of Congress. And that would be the shortest route, as far as I can tell. The shortest route, having studied this issue for a very long time, the shortest route to Lower Snake Dam removal would be convincing Congress through a popular movement, which various groups have been undertaking for a really long time. A popular movement to convince Congress to pass a law providing for money and providing for and directing the Corps of Engineers, right? And the Corps of Engineers, they always present themselves as just being servants of the public, right? They'll do whatever Congress tells them, whatever their masters tell them to do, they're happy to do. It's more work for them too, right? In a way, they'd be happy. Hey, we got a big new project. We got to restore Celilo Falls, or we got a big new project. We got to rewild the snake, right? And some of them might get real excited about that. I would imagine some of the people who work for the Corps of Engineers, some of the military personnel would probably get real excited. They're probably among the best educated landscape architects in the whole country, working for the Corps of Engineers. And they might get really excited about the idea, about that challenge, right? Of taking this river system that 40, 50, 60 years ago was fundamentally altered, right, by humans. And now our goal is to rewild it. We can't restore it, right? That would connote somehow making it the way it was, right? Just the way. That's never going to happen. But we can rewild it, right? Which is kind of an important distinction. I like to use that term, rewild. So it would be, some people in the Army Corps of Engineers might take it up as a wonderful challenge and get real excited about it. You never know. But they present themselves as functionaries, right? They're just doing what the public wants them to do. And, I'm not sure if they actually have a vested interest in maintaining those dams or not. You'd think they would, because they're the ones that built them, and they probably do. But all these other groups have some kind of vested interests. Okay, for those of you who somehow didn't get the memo, very near the beginning of the term, but the great dam building era in North America, and that was from the early 1930s until roughly the late 60s, early 70s, was inspired by the conservation movement. Okay? Never forget that, right? And these are the Group A conservationists that won the day. Back then, right, in the first 4 or 5 decades of the 20th century, the Group A conservationists defined the meaning and value of conservation work, right? And for them, the meaning and value of conservation work was maximizing benefit for human beings. And so these dams on the Lower Snake River were justified in the name of Group A conservationism, primarily. These wise users came along somewhat later, but obviously this one interpretation of what it means to manage resources for the greatest good, for the greatest number, for the longest period of time, right? That's the conservationist maxim. And the dominant interpretation of that maxim has led directly to all these dam building projects, okay? So never forget that. Flood control, I put flood control, and anybody does just a moment of research about the Lower Snake dams will discover, lo and behold, that they don't serve any flood control purpose at all. In fact, most of the dams in the whole system are run-of-the-river dams. Very few of them actually were constructed to provide flood control benefits. That was another one of those little zombie ideas that back in the day, they used repeatedly. In fact, there's a strong tie-in to PSU, right? What did PSU used to be called?
Vanport.
Vanport, yeah. Vanport was the third largest city, or the second or third largest city in Oregon. And it was in the shipyards there, in North Portland. And and that's where Dr. Stephen Epler, the main inspiration to Vanport College, which is PSU, his goal actually was to make liberal arts education available to underserved communities, to communities which were traditionally not served, didn't have access, right? And that's why they put Vanport College way over there in Vanport, because there's this big city where, it was working class, totally working class. Dr. Epler wanted those people to have access to a high quality, not just training like business school or engineering, but a high quality liberal arts education. So you can thank Dr. Epler really for the existence of a philosophy department at Vanport College, which became PSU. But anyway, they got flooded out, right? It was this huge flood, happened in 1948. And that led to a huge and then they moved Vanport over here downtown, right? And they renamed it PSU. Anyway, but that flood and all that destruction and all that loss of life led to this huge public outcry for new dams, right? I'm not sure how many of them had been built, but probably only about half, I'm going to say. The Lower Snake dams hadn't been built. Bonneville and the Dalles had been built. McNary, which is the next one up past the Dalles, had not been built. Oh, excuse me, John Day. John Day had not been built. McNary, which is way up there, near the confluence of the Snake, anyway, about half of the dams in the system had been built, but half of them hadn't been. And then that flood happened, and of course the Corps of Engineers and other people who wanted these make work projects, right, wanted to build more dams, they seized on that natural disaster to justify, anyway. And that's what happened, right? And we ended up with a whole bunch more dams as a result of public outcry. But the dirty little secret is that very few of these dams actually provide any flood control benefits. They're run-of-the-river dams. All 4 of the Lower Snake River dams are run-of-the-river dams. They provide absolutely no flood control. In terms of electricity generation, statistics show they generate 4 or 5% of the overall production, so it's relatively small. And of course, hydropower is fungible, right? It can be replaced. The only thing that can't be replaced when it comes to those 4 Lower Snake dams, guess what? Right? And isn't it interesting how when Lewis and Clark, they were the first, Americans, right? The first Americans appointed by President Jefferson to travel down these waterways, right? To travel down the Snake and Columbia, right? And what was their mission? Their mission was to chart the Northwest Passage, right? In those days, it was believed that there was a Northwest Passage that connected the headwaters of the Missouri with the headwaters of the Columbia and Snake, right? And it would be an easy matter of just crossing over a little hill and then putting your canoes right back in the water and floating down to the ocean, right? They thought it would be that easy. Of course, they were in error. But what's interesting is that's how they viewed. When Jefferson saw these maps, right? These rough maps that people didn't really understand what was out here in the early 1800s, late 1700s, right? When Jefferson was looking at these maps, what he expected was to find a navigation system. That was the whole goal. That was the central goal of Lewis and Clark, right? was to claim this navigation system. And so lo and behold, now that's basically what the river has been turned into, right? And not much else. And that's why, if anything, that's why those dams, these guys have tremendous clout. You look up Tidewater Barge Company and their lobbyists. I think they have a monopoly. There might be one other, don't quote me on this, but there are one or two barge companies that have a monopoly on all barge traffic. In other words, the federal government gives them all the contracts. I'm not even sure, I should know more about this, but anyway. And supposedly all these barges, every barge you see traveling up and down the river is heavily subsidized by taxpayer money because the people, right, because the companies who are using the system to get their goods to market, right, they're using our waterways, right, our dams, our locks, our socialist dam system, for crying out loud, built in the socialist era of the 1930s and 40s and 50s, right? They're all socialist dams. And that these the barge companies and the companies that move their goods on the barges are getting subsidized by the federal government because they're not paying the full cost, not even close to the full cost of operating those locks and those dams. So anyway, it's really a scandal. And it's a familiar story. You start to see this familiar pattern when you look at the history of natural resource policy in the United States. But you see these special interests, right, who are benefiting enormously. I mean, there are like 11 families or something that have agricultural interests, mostly orchards, I think, fruit orchards, in the lower Snake River Plateau. And they are getting all these benefits, right, from irrigation benefits from those reservoirs behind those dams. But even that is fungible, right? I mean, you can extend the pipes, you can do all kinds of things, and they can still get roughly the same amount of water. This right here is what's not fungible. This right here is what you can't just pick up and, get somewhere else. You need, right? Anyway, but there are also railways all up and down the river too, and that's how, before this whole hydro system was developed, it was a very efficient way, and it still remains more efficient, actually. A way of moving goods up and down is through rail. In any event, but these are, as far as I can tell, the kinds of, here we have the two philosophical traditions, right? And then below here, we have a whole set of sort of stakeholders, right? Groups or people who have who hold a stake in maintaining these dams, right? Policy option one is business as usual, okay? So we're going to have I think about 10 to 12, all right? 10 to 12 people who are going to be on this team, all right? And your leader is going to divide you up into these different constituent groups, these different stakeholder groups, okay? You see how that's going to work? And then policy option two is very simple. Just remove the 4 lower Snake dams and do your best to rewild the lower Snake River. And then on the environmental side, this is the proponents of policy option 2. This group is going to be larger, okay? It has to be larger because this is an environmental ethics course, and you can go, if you want to go do the same exercise in the business college, the business school, right? And you can have the larger group be the pro-dam people. But here we're going to. Anyway, no, obviously we have a lot more positions to represent, a lot more roles to play, right? So these are the kind of roles I have in mind. And in general, we're going to divide our proponents of policy option 2 into 2 camps, okay? The more than anthro camp and the anthro camp, all right? And notice again, right? The deep ecologists are here in the more, so that kind of in a way, the course kind of flows out, into this big ocean, and in the big ocean, the deep ecologists are confronting the social ecologists, right? In any event, and that's why it was very nice to study, to take our little meta-ethical journey, I think. You start with Leopold, and then you go through all the work that these different philosophers have done to try to explain a land ethic, right? What does a land ethic consist of? And some of them, like Norton, constructs it in a very anthropocentric way, and some of them, and the social ecologists too. Probably you could say the same about, I suggested one day that Norton is, in a way, he's a strategic anthropocentrist, right? Because he doesn't want to answer the metaphysical question. He says, I just don't know. And we don't have the tools to answer the question of whether or not an ecological whole has moral status. We don't know, right? That's some big, vast metaphysical question. And so I'm just going to stick with what I know, right? And strategically, I know that if we organize natural resource policy around long-term human health and well-being, right? If we are strategic at least, right? Strategically anthropocentric, then we're going to accomplish everything that environmentalists want to accomplish, right? And then he would cite his convergence hypothesis, and he would show that the policies advocated by the deep ecologists converge and end up being the same as the policies advocated by the weak anthropocentrists, right? And social ecologists can probably be fairly described in similar terms as strategic anthropocentrists who argue that all kinds of other things might have moral status and, you know, direct, independent moral status, but it's still best to organize our natural resource policy around long-term human interests. Okay, and social ecologists, you know, would be very, very concerned about human health and the things I mentioned. Campaign to eliminate toxins from human bodies, right? So that, or just from breast milk, right? I mean, the social ecologists could organize a comprehensive global environmental cleanup around the single goal of eliminating PCBs in women's breast milk, right? Because just doing that, tackling that one problem, would end up addressing a host of grievances about the chemical industry, right? That non-humans would have if they had a voice, right? So anyway, that's the kind of, you know, we haven't studied social ecology yet. We will next week. And just keep it, you know, the social ecology is much more of a social justice tradition, okay? Which is a very old tradition, right? It goes back at least as far as Jesus, and much older than that, obviously, too, right? This basic idea, you know, a lot of their argument is a basic fairness argument about allocation of natural resources. In any event, we'll study social ecology next week. And then heads up for this brilliant essay that we read if there's one essay that you definitely shouldn't skip, you know, you could say that about almost every essay, but David Watson's Against the Mega Machine, we read for Thursday of week 9. So we read that a week from today. I always look forward to that. But, all right, so what I would expect is that, you know, you'd have some leeway, but I have a sign-up sheet too. And I think I accorded certain space to different kinds of roles that you could play. Does this sound like it might be fun? Yeah? Some enthusiastic people? Yeah? I hope so. We had a lot of fun. Oh, and that reminds me, you can see last terms. Oh, and this is another reason why more people might start bowing out of the group project now, because guess what? I'm going to put it on YouTube. And you can see last terms. Go to Cloud Coyote, and then go to TSOT, because last term we did this mock hearing on the Tesoro Savage Oil Terminal at the Port of Vancouver. So those of you who are